Solidarity. I am Martin, I'm from over in the UK, and I at last chose to sit down and review an account of mine that I initially intended to compose last Halloween. I wound up delaying horribly and didn't kick it off in time yet this year. I'm focused on getting this reviewed. I've been a fan for some time furthermore. I generally thought it'd be cool to contribute and ideally hear my story peruse out. Regardless of whether it is the tale of such a horrendous memory, I guess it'll be a decent thought. Practice in a manner returning to something from my life as a youngster, and it's likewise given me motivation to connect with a portion of my old companions to get their memories off the occasion. So with no further babbling, this is the story of my own loathsomeness back when me and my old optional school period gathering of companions were still thumping around together. We chose to work on something for Halloween. We were all 16 going on 17, still exceptionally innocent, yet with lots of lost certainty. There were lots of local gatherings or bar evenings and things to go to, yet for one explanation or another we were unable to get into any of them. Then, at that point, as the evening seeped into the afternoon and the sun began to go down, it was seeming to be if we had any desire to have a great time, we'd need to make our only figured out how to pool what minimal expenditure we could snag, and afterwards sent the most seasoned looking among us into an off permit to get some liquor. I didn't think it work. We attempted generally something similar studies previously, and our most seasoned looking mate had been immediately. I did so when my old mate Mary left that off permit with a full plastic pack in each hand. We celebrated like we just won the lottery. The main disadvantage was that her mate had returned with 3 jugs off wine, not lager, that we'd requested that he purchase. It said he overreacted without desparathan at that point requested the red wine since he felt like it caused him to appear to be more seasoned. He'd figured out how to get a couple of bundles of cigarettes as well, so as much as the red wine wasn't the very thing we'd been expecting, our night was fundamentally gint. We could have effectively blagged our presently way into the local party, too, as the liquor gave us a monstrous influence. Nobody needed 4 or 5 fellows going up to a party with essentially nothing, however, with wine in tow and with the potential to get more, we'd handily get a welcome. Or, on the other hand, too, however, at that point, as we strolled and talked, examining our expected choices as a whole, we reached a kind of joint resolution. Every one of the gatherings that had avoided or moved around welcoming us could simply mess with her off. We had every one of the makings of a decent night, and it looked bad to spread the wine slender when we could simply neck everything ourselves. So rather than pursuing young ladies like we planned to, we snatched a convenient speaker and a few firelighters and afterwards set out toward this old home base that we knew off to get some security. So a couple of hours went by. We got our fire going, got the speaker working, and afterward alternated kind of glugging down the wine and making an effort not to vomit. You need to recall this was one of our first times drinking, and we were on the least expensive terrible iced red wine you can envision, so obviously it was like becoming inebriated on vinegar. In any case, picture the scene. We are in general lounged around the fire. Furthermore, since our old home base was in a concealed corner of a seriously unpleasant piece of parkland, there could have been no other lights with the exception of the fire, and what little light was falling off of our janky early 2000s mobiles. One of us, a chap called Luke, some way or another wound up attempting to reproduce the minutes from the sparkling beat for beat. What's more, we are in general chuckling, attempting to have Shell Duvall's influence to his Jack Nicholson. We were by and large clearly, and I recollect that much, yet we were being noisy in light of the fact that we had a solid sense of reassurance. The recreation area was essentially abandoned into the evening, and that issue it turned out to be a chill spot for us, a spot that we could get some security to do everything our folks are. On the other hand, neighbors wouldn't support us doing. Nobody had at any point meddled with us prior to, not so much as a sniff, so we didn't expect a solitary soul other than us to be in the recreation area that evening. We had to Total Lila our gatekeeper down and we paid for it. I recollect the scene as was I recently. Luke was all the while doing his Jack torn impression, standing somewhat back from the fire with the goal that it was as it were at some degree lit by the flare's orange gleam. All I saw was a shape climbing behind him and subsequent to doing a kind of speedy mental head count. I understood that it wasn't any of us playing some sort of trick. I thought back up and all I saw was a veil, or if nothing else, the cover this complete outsider was wearing, and afterward swung something at Luke's head. Everything happened so quick that Luke was on the floor, and we were all still responding to it then as the mass individual, with what had all the earmarks of being a major stick, begun crushing Luke with it. When he was all the way down, we as a whole begun to jump up in protection. It was only a stomach response, actually, simply in light of the fact that it seemed as though we had him dwarfed. However, we didn't have him dwarfed, and we before long understood exactly how much difficulty we were in. Simply recollect one of my mates backing off as the concealed man swung for him with the stick, and afterward unexpectedly there were heaps of them emerging from the murkiness, tossing punches and kicks. Most had their appearances covered either with mass or with drawings of their hoods pulled tight. Every one of us got a decent kicking, both attempting to retaliate and all the while attempting to move away. It was finished disorder for some time, simply running and stumbling, also attempting to get some distance between us. At one point, right when I saw my different mates running, also concluded going along with them was ideal. Somebody threw my legs free from me, and afterward I was simply attempting to get back up. They slammed my head into the soil, either with a hand or stepping on the back of my head. In the event that it had been concrete, they did it on. I think I'd have supported a serious injury. However, since it was simply sodden soil and leaf litter, it didn't have a lot of impact, and some way or another I had the option to continue to run and get away. Now Luke was all right. He wound up going through the night in the clinic, however, was released late the following day with a terrible blackout and some awful swelling. Sincerely, we were fortunate that it is the most horrendously terrible. It get right up to the present day. I have no clue about why those fellows went after us or who they were for. I realize they might have been individuals. We went to class with individuals in the neighborhood. We, as a matter of fact, I realize the world can be a brutal place. However, that is, I learned exactly the way that horrible it could truly be. Conciliatory sentiments ahead of time. Assuming I sound like an overprotective dolt here, I took Mickey going house to house, asking for candy one time, and afterward swore that she'd be back by check-in time each Halloween until she turned 18, on the grounds that it was absolutely impossible that in damnation that I was letting her go any place out on that day of mischief. Conceded things didn't go down like that, and I quieted adequately down to be chill about going house to house, asking for candy, and later outfit parties. I'm simply inquisitive. Be aware, assuming toward the finish of this you think that would be an overcompensation, or on the other hand, I viewed be this equivalent degree of gone crazy as I was. So I took my child on one of those regulated going house to house, asking for candy things. When she was around 5, her school coordinated it and requested volunteers among guardians, so he chipped in. I didn't chip in light of the fact that I was frightened to let my girl out of my sight. I elected to be useful. I continuously cherished Halloween growing up, so I imagined that it'd be amazing to remember a portion of that occasional soul with my girl. I wouldn't fret when her educator let me know that it was in the interest of decency that I didn't direct the gathering that incorporated my girl. They didn't believe that I should risk inclining toward my own child and ensuring that she got more candy than different children. Some could say that that is a bit enthusiastic, yet I comprehended where she was coming from, so I let my child go off with some other mother, confiding in her to mind my child as cautiously as I'd mentors. 30 minutes could never have gone by before somebody brought up the caution. The youngster was missing, and from the portrayal immediately worked out That the masinkid was my own, I don't for even a moment figure words can contact. How frightening a second that was for me. So, I'm not in any event going to attempt. I'll just let you know what I did rather, which wasrin round the local, calling out for my little girl and doing every conceivable thing I couldn't to choke the mother who ought to have been watching my child. In the end, I saw as her leaving a front yard acting all confounded as though, however, she hadn't done anything wrong. I asked her what on God's green earth she was thinking, however, at that point embraced her and told her how frightened I was. I was only a wreck, and I felt far more atrocious as my girl began to cry. The entire thing put down the going house to house asking for candy, as it clearly terrified the poop out of the multitude of children seeing me going around and yelling. I felt terrible for disturbing them everything except at something similar time on the off chance that that moronic woman hadn't lost Mickid, then none of it would have been Isu. I was still sort of frantic at my girl, so I was in full discipline mode until not long before her sleep time, when we got to discussing for what reason she'd strolled away from the gathering into a house that didn't have a stunt or treaters welcomies in on it. We posted them ourselves in days preceding the occasion, inquiring families to show them in their windows or on their yards in the event that they needed to take part. The children knew to pay special attention to houses with the signs, since that implied candy. So, when my girl let me know that somebody had welcomed her to go around the back of their home to get some treats, there my ears pricked up. She certainly went through a lying stage at one point, be that as it may. I immediately figured out how to detect hurdle tales. This thing about the man didn't seem like one by any means, and no doubt about it, I felt the chill go through me when Sheriff for instance trust me. Assuming she knew that'd have the option to blame it, my little girl would have emerged with it first thing to hold herself back from getting into inconvenience, yet she didn't. Also, that is the thing made me imagine that she was coming clean. I brought it up with my better half very quickly in a real sense when I put my little girl told he knew about a site that you would be able to check for youngster wrongdoers in your region, and simply hearing those words made me feel debilitated, yet not so wiped out as I felt at the point when he looked through our area and viewed as able read at the location my girl had been. And we called the police when we had the option, and quick version our call brought about a man return to jail for abusing parole conditions. I'm not a legal counselor or anything. What's more, I won't claim to know the regulations or rules that he broke, and I didn't go finding him like my significant other did a short time later for our own mental soundness. Other than no point in bringing this up again, and not to need to stress over that man any longer. It demolished me for a couple of years. However, I mean, I was a worrywart when it came to letting our little girl go any place with anybody, and it took me a long opportunity to have the option to forget all that dread. Yet, I arrived, and it was to everybody's benefit, since I have most likely that man has demolished individuals' lives previously, and the last thing I at any point hope to do is turned into one more of his casual ties with there truly having been a wrongdoing committed. The last time I ever went trick-or-treating was when I was 13 years old, and my friends from middle school kind of knew it was the final time, as we talked about not being able to go once we got at high school. We didn't want to do anything that might get the crap bullied out of us, so we bars. This wasn't the case at all, and if anything, we got less candy than thieverage trick-or-treater, because we mad homers get off of their butts again when they believed that they were all done for the night. We struck it lucky here and there, so we definitely walked our way with a good haul. Figured that we better make the most of what was probably our last hera, and that's how we came up with what I believed was a galaxy brain plan to get sacks full of leftover candy from all the houses in our neighborhood. All smaller kids used to go out before dark and would be off the streets by 5:30 at the latest. Then came the kids round our age who were old enough to walk around unsupervised. They'd make their rounds grab a few handfuls here and there then. They generally be off the streets by like 8 o'clock to 8:30 p.m., and that's when we'd strike in that sweet, sweet window between 8:30 and 900 we could swoop in and scoop up as much leftover candy as possible. We totally convinced ourselves that, since it was approaching the end of acceptable trick-or-treating hours, folks would just proc us whatever they had left over instead of trying to find space in their kitchen for 50+ minutes at the end of the night. But then the night didn't exactly end with us walking away, more like running away as fast as our legs could carry us, because that Halloween night, on my very final trick-or-treat session before retirement, had the single scariest event in my childhood happen. Like I said, we did okay in terms of candy haul, but on the way back home, we spotted one odd-standing house that we hadn't been to. I won't try to describe all the geography of the neighborhood in detail, but the house was slightly out of the way from the main residential streets, meaning that there was a chance that they hadn't had as many trick-or-treaters as the other house, and therefore more left over candy. We walked up the path hoping Simeon was home, only to see that all the lights are on and that the front porch is decorated much like all the other houses we'd stopped at. But unlike all the others, the decorations here were in another level. We'd already seen one place that had the super realistic grave right there on the lawn. Whoever owned the home had cut up a section of the lawn, roughed up the soil a little, then put down a fake headstone before mocking up a skeleton crawling out. Different pumpkins dotted around the place. From one spot on the porch there was a fake skeleton hanging from a rope, and then there was also this mannequin-looking thing that had been propped up against the low wall near where the stairs to the front porch were. It was impressive, but not nearly as impressive as the two big bowls of candy that sandwiched the front door. Each had a sign taped above it that said "Help yourselves," and even from halfway up the driveway we could see that they still had a ton of candy in them. I guess that makes it sound like we had sort of eagle eyes or something, but they were in colored semi-clear plastic, and since the porch was all lit up, we could all see that they still had stuff in them. As you can imagine, we just about hit the roof. It was exactly the kind of thing that we were hoping for when we came up with our big galaxy brain plan to nab all the leftover candy. So we then walked up the rest of the driveway, rubbing our greasy little palms like rats who got the cheese. But then the closer we got to the porch, the more clearly we were able to see the mannequin-looking thing, and the more able to see it we were, the more realistic it looked. The one thing that kept me personally from thinking it was real was the amount of fake blood on the ground next to it. There was no way anyone could have bled that much and still be alive. We all kind of slowed down as we get close to it, and I remember straining as I got closer and closer to the stairs, and too it as I got right up to them, it heard my two friends saying, "Nah, that's not real. I can tell it's like movie magic or something," and being the total fool that I am, that led me into a false sense of comfort, because as soon as my foot hit the porch steps the mannequin raised its head, reached an arm out towards me, and then sort of rashed this hostly voice, "Please help me." We just ran as far and fast as we could, but when we stopped there was actually a moment of disagreement before we worked out what to do next. I remember being convinced that it was real. I'd seen the guy's face, looked into his eyes, and something just screamed authenticity to me. Either this guy was some expert horror movie extra who decided to play an exceptionally cruel Halloween prank, maybe even for the benefit of some hidden camera, or it was real, and so me and desperately needed our help. My buddy, who thought it was fake, kept on saying how it was just some dumb prank that we'd fallen for, whereas I kept saying that we needed to call 911. This was back before every kid had a cell phone with him at all times, so it wasn't like I could just override my booty and call the cops right there. Instead I had to override him and run to the nearest house to hammer on the door until someone appeared. I was actually kind of worried that they think that it was a prank, but I guess I got across The seriousness of the situation. Because if he went and called the fire department right away, the lady called, then asked you to take her to where we'd seen the injured guy. And she'd followed us with a bunch of kitchen towels as soon as we get there. And the lady saw that the guy still popped up near the stairs. She yelled at us to run home to our parents right away. She yelled like we were in trouble, but looking back on it, I guess she was just scared and didn't want kids round to see a guy potentiality. We ended up being declared heroes for saving this guy's life. He was all alone at home when he slipped and fell in the kitchen while holding a knife, and the poor guy ended up sort of skewering himself in the process, I guess. I don't know if he just couldn't get to the phone, but he ended up trying to walk out into the street for help, thinking that he could get some trick-or-treaters to call 911, but he couldn't, and he collapsed, and then a few minutes later, we find him. It was a complete accident, but I guess any excuse to celebrate is a good one. And we ended up receiving little hero medals at Thanksgiving fair that year, kind of a wholesome end to what should be a scary story, I know, but I kind of like that the scariest thing to happen to me's a kid also happens to have a happy ending, and not one that haunted me or even traumatized me for years afterwards. Have you ever had a memory from your childhood that you just couldn't place? By that, I mean a memory from your childhood that feels more like a dream or something you saw on TV that can have worked its way into your memory banks until you thought it happened. And for real, I know that might sound confusing. So here's a better example. One of my friends used to swear that one time when they were a kid, they quite literally flew up the stairs. Me and a mutual just about dead lying when she told us, and we poked and prodded the story until we figured out a much more believable version of truth. She didn't fly up the stairs, she was just super tired one night, and her mom or dad carried her to bed, but because she was half asleep, it felt like she just floated up the stairs, maybe being carried while unconscious, somehow worked its way into an actual dream that she was having. My point is, it was like a false memory. A better example might be Micahson, who swore her mom's hair salon used to be in a different spot, but it just felt that way because her perception of the world around her changed as she got older. Hopefully I just didn't spend thepis while sounding like a crazy person, and that you or your people here might have their own examples of these sort of false or glitchy memories. That way I won't sound like I'm fresh out of the psych ward when I tell me own false memory story, or at least story of what I thought was a false memory. Okay, so for the longest time, I had this weird obscure memory tucked away that I was pretty sure was just a dream or night that I had when I was a kid. I went to a birthday party, and at the birthday party, there was a cow taking a nap in the kids' front lawn. This cow wasn't just any old cow either. It was so stinky that it made me cry, and he had to go home. My mom was mad that our neighbors had been keeping a stinky cow, and I was so upset that I missed Theparty that I cried myself to sleep. I'd like to think that people can understand I figured none of that had actually happened, but if you can't, let's just say that it seemed way too ridiculous a memory to be real, and that although it turned out to be wrong to have assumed so, I thought it was something I dreamed or imagined, or whatever. But then, as the years went by and my teens turned to my mid-20s and then to my early 30s, it was this bizarrely prevalent memory that never seemed to feel any less vivid. So one day, on a total whim, I asked my mom if she remembered taking me to a party where the family kept a cow. I expected her to just give me this look as if to say, "Are you crazy?" But instead she gave me another one, this kind of look someone gives you when you stir up a memory that hasn't been thought about in years. Mom didn't laugh, though she didn't even smile when she recalled it. She just shook her head, sighed, and made some comment about how awful the whole thing was. As you can probably guess, my mind was completely blown by the news that this weird fake, but not fake memory had been real the entire time, and as you can probably also guess, I hounded her to tell me exactly what had happened from start to Finish. So first things first, it wasn't a birthday party, it was a Halloween party, but according to my mom, there really had been a cow. I was like 6 years old at the time, so I was walking hand in hand with Mimum up this long driveway which led to me friend's house. We live in the suburbs, so there were a lot of big houses like that, but the more we walked up the driveway, the more we started to smell this rotten stink from somewhere. Then, when the driveway finally curved around before opening up into the home's front yard, there it was still daylight, and some kind of tarp or covering had sort of blown back, revealing the cow's back and top of its shed. The way it was lying was kind of murky the first, guess because it stopped me from seeing all the damage that had been done. But my mom saw it right away. She saw all the marks of blood, all the flies that were crawling all over this big old dead cow that was just lying there on their front lawn. She takes me up and away pretty much the moment she saw it, so only I caught a glimpse of a super stinky cow. But apparently the smell was so bad, and he was so disappointed not being able to go to the party, that I sort of burst out into tears the moment she loaded me in top passenger seat of her car. It turns out that the birthday kid's parents had tried calling everyone to let them know that the party was cancelled, but had apparently forgotten to one set of parents know. For me personally, that was the last I heard of it. I don't remember it coming up actual or anything, and the party got scheduled, so that made up for the disappointment, and I spent the rest of me life kind of half forgetting it all. But my mom remembered the word aftermath of the whole thing. The family whose lawn the dead cow showed up on had no idea how it had gotten there, or at least they said they didn't know anything about it. They just woke up one day, and there it was, this big mutilated cow corpse on their front lawn. They said that it must have been dumped there overnight, and they're so freaked out that they called the cops. And the cops then told them the area was a potential crime scene, in which case Theco couldn't be moved and the party would have to be cancelled. But get this, the main reason why the cops treated it so seriously was that the cow obviously belonged to someone, and since they were expecting someone to make a criminal complaint, they started looking for evidence on who would do such a thing. From what my mom says, it was real fortunate that the cow was lying there the way it was, or I'd have seen that almost all of its body had been ripped up. Mom said it was like someone had lowered it into a shredder or something, and then pulled it back out before its whole body could be torn apart. There were some livestock farms about 10 to 15 mi away, so it wasn't out of the question that a cow had escaped, wandered all the way towards Stapleton, and then gone to attacked by coyotes or something. But then the complaint came in. The farmer was out near Kimball, which weighs over 150 mi to the west. Cops confirmed when they matched up the serial numbers on the cow's tag. But then how the hell did a cow make it 150 plus miles overnight? There were rumors that there was some sort of cattle beef, no pun intended, and by that I mean a disagreement between owners of cattle that had escalated to violence. And by then, the family whose lawn the cow had got dumped on had nothing to do with the livestock industry, and neither did they have any relatives in the industry either. To everyone's knowledge, no one in the neighborhood had any connection to the industry either, so people started to wonder if it was a case of mistaken address or something of that nature. Guy of ducks a cow, hacks it up, and then dumps it on a lawn as a sort of warning, only they got the wrong lawn, and it caused a truckload of confusion, I guess, because it happened on Halloween. That led to a bunch of dumb rumors about it being some kind of supernatural occurrence. He can pretty much guess the kind of things. People blamed it on UFOs, Wendigo, skinwalkers, you name it, but everyone figured that there had to be a logical explanation to it, and that the truth was probably just as gruesome and frightening as any kind-of ghost or goblin. No one figured out exactly what happened, I guess, because they didn't need to. The farmer could just make an insurance claim. The cops didn't have much to investigate, and everyone just moved on after a while. I guess just kind of crazy that all that became so remote to me that I didn't think it was actually real, especially when it's something that many people would never forget. On the night of October 3, 1973, 9-year-old Girl Scout Lisa Ann French, who's walking to a neighborhood Halloween party in her hometown of Angela Quiskins. Lisa lived with her mother stepfather and her newborn half-brother, and since her parents were so occupied with childcare, and the party was on little blocks away at the aptly named Pumpkin Place that allowed young Lisa to walk alone, she departed her family home at around 5:45 p.m., almost an hour after sunset, dressed as a hobo in a little black black hat, green parka, and jeans complete with blue masking tape over the knees. She had originally planned to walk to a party with a friend named Ann Parker, and since Ann had managed to get herself grounded in the days prior, Lisa was forced to walk in solitude. As she walked, Lisa noticed that other groups of children were trick-or-treating, and since she was familiar with her immediate neighbors, she decided to follow suit. She first stopped at the home of a classmate, then at the house of one of her elementary school teachers, but the final house Lisa stopped at that night was owned by Gerald Miles Turner. 24-year-old Turner resided at that property with his girlfriend and infant child, and since they lived in such close proximity, he and Lisa were almost certainly familiar with only another. After seeing her on his doorstep, Turner invited Lisa inside. He explained that he hadn't prepared any bowls of candy from which trick-or-treaters could take a handful, but if she followed him into his kitchen, was welcome to help herself. The 99-year-old Girl Scout accepted the invitation and reportedly waited patiently while Turner searched for sweet treats. Seconds later, he walked out of the kitchen, leaving Lisa somewhat confused, and then moments later she heard Turner's voice calling out to her from up the stairs. "Sweetie, just found some candy for you," he said, "but it's up here up in my bedroom." Lisa knew Gerald Turner. He'd been a feature of the neighborhood for as long as she could remember, so when she heard his voice, Lisa walked out of the kitchen and ascended the stairs. What followed is perhaps the most sickening act of predatory violence I had ever had the misfortune of researching. Even if describing Lisa's death wouldn't immediately get this video demonetized, I wouldn't be in the least bit comfortable describing the moments preceding it. And somehow the least obscene aspect of the attack also happens to be its most terrifying. You see, Turner didn't intend to end Lisa's life, at least not at the moment she expired. But the fact remains that Lisa was so completely and utterly overwhelmed with terror that she suffered a heart attack before Turner could finish assaulting her. Turner later claimed that when he noticed that Lisa was no longer breathing, he made a desperate attempt to resuscitate her, but it was too late. His sound vile predations had ended her young life before it ever really began. Turner's girlfriend Arlene Penn had actually been attending the same party Lisa had been headed for, and returned home at 7 p.m. to find her boyfriend acting very strangely. Turner was wearing a bathrobe and implored her not to enter their bedroom or the ensuite bathroom, claiming he'd vomited and defecated all over the and carpet. It's possible that Arlene did indeed smell something awful coming from their bedroom, so to give her boyfriend some space to clean up and recuperate, she drove over to her mother's house to pay her a visit. Turner rushed into action, stuffing Lisa's lifeless body and clothes in the separate bags before driving her remains out to the lakeside suburb. After there, he dumped her clothes and bogged into a field just off of Mape Road, wearing socks on his hands in an attempt to prevent the transfer of forensic evidence. Once the disposal process was finished, Turner rushed back home and had resumed the facade of suffering from a sudden but violent illness. By the time his girlfriend returned from her mother's, Lisa was due to return home in around 7 that evening, but when the hour came and when her mother started to worry by 10 p.m., her parents had contacted the police and were in the process of gathering up an impromptu search party consisting of friends and family that would patrol the surrounding Jaegers until dawn the next morning. As the days went by, the ad hoc Search team was joined by a jaw-dropping 5,000 additional volunteers from all over the Midwestern United States, along with 700 police officers, National Guardsmen, and Lisa's fellow Girl Scouts. It wasn't until 4 days into the search that a farmer discovered Lisa's remains, and at 11:30 a.m. on November 3, the search was finally called off. Her funeral was held on November 6 of 1973 at Fondle Emmanuel Trinity Lutheran Church. Thousands of the city's residents turned out to pay the respects, while the City Chamber of Commerce posted a $10 reward for any information leading to the capture of Lisa's killer. Gerald Turner watched the unfolding grief and even attended a memorial service for Lisa in the company of his girlfriend and child. Since his home lay in the vicinity of the area Lisa was believed to have been abducted from, Turner was always a suspect, but for nearly long months he feigned the same ignorance and grief as his neighbors and insisted that he was an innocent man. Then, during the midsummer of 1974, Fond du Lac police invited Turner to take a polygraph test. Turner seemed more than happy to oblige them, but when their results came back inconclusive, the police increased their focus when they asked him to provide samples of his body. Herr Turner once again seemed happy to cooperate. He believed he'd adequately cleaned down Lisa's corpse, searing out forensic connections between himself and his victim. He was wrong when confronted with what he believed was concrete evidence of his deal. Gerald Turner offered a full and frank admission, and on August 4 of 1974, he officially confessed the murder of Lisa. French. In his shockingly despicable confession, Turner admitted to being highly aroused by the sight of 9-year-old Lisa on his doorstep, and that he'd seized the opportunity to do something unspeakably evil in his own defense. Gerald claimed he'd attempted to resuscitate Lisa upon realizing that she was no longer breathing, but had been interrupted by the return of his girlfriend and child. Despite making such a complete confession, Turner took his chances at trial by jury. The fact that a child predator believed that they could win over a public opinion and thus win a lesser sentence of manslaughter is as ridiculous as it is horrifying. As you can imagine, the jury not only pronounced him guilty, but recommended that he serve the maximum of sentence possible under Wisconsin state law. The state abolished capital punishment back in 1853, meaning execution was never on the table, so instead the presiding judge sentenced Turner to 38 years for second-degree murder, enticing a child for immoral purposes. Shockingly, despite beginning a sentence of almost 40 years in 1975, Turner first received parole in October of 1992 on account of so-called good behavior. The news provoked mass outrage from communities all over Wisconsin as well as the wider United States. When Turner was released from the Hoon Correctional Institute and driven to a halfway house over in Milwaukee, local residents turned out to protest the decision to house him in their backyard. Turner required police protection for the duration of his stay until the decision was made to move him somewhere more distant, as both the public and media acclaimed for justice. State lawmakers proposed a piece of legislation known as Wisconsin Chapter 980, more colloquially known as Turner's Law. Turner's Law would require high-risk offenders to be remanded in mental institutions up nearly parole, and it passed unanimously just 18 months later. Thankfully, by this point, Turner had already been sent back to prison for following immense public pressure, but it wouldn't be long until he was up for parole again on January 28th of 1998. A parole board decided that Turner was no longer a violent predator and that he was permitted to begin the second of his mandatory paroles. Just a few months later, a judge heard how Turner had lost his temper with a castle worker and had threatened to stab her to death during a meeting in his halfway house. Unbelievably, the judge refused to accept that Turner was a continued danger to the public and even backed him in a discrimination case, where in a company known as Waste Management of Madison was forced to either hire him or pay him a large out-of-court settlement. The company opted for Settlement following Turner's successful litigation against the company through Wisconsin State Assembly passed a bill allowing employers to legally discriminate against convicted felons on the basis of their criminal record without further complaints. 5 years later, in 2003, the people of Wisconsin celebrated when it was announced that Turner was to be imprisoned manner in person or online. So when a search of his home computer revealed a huge stash of adult content, Turner's fate was sealed. It was around this time that a journalist managed to obtain a letter taken from Turner's parole application penned by Turner himself. It was addressed to Lisa in French, and sections of it read as follows, quote, "I doubt that I could ever fully realize the terror you experienced at my hands. I can still see you standing in the doorway with that felt hat beaming. A thieving recognize me, then I see the delight in your eyes turn to fear as I close the door behind you. The rest off me life I'll have to live with what I did to you on the night I became a monster like. Do swear to you on the forfeiture of my life that I will never harm another child." This might give the impression that Turner felt remorse for what he'd done, but another section of the letter cast doubt on his apparent regret. "If I had killed you on some other day like Valentine's Day, nobody would have gave Adam, only that's where he's wrong. The horrifying predatory assault of a 9-year-old girl is never ever going to be a story deemed unnewsworthy worthy by anyone in their right mind, where Astroner on the other hand seems to think that it's nothing but antediluvian suspicion that's earned him such comments provide the basis for the campaign to ensure that Turner stays in prison for the rest of his life. He should never be released, said Lisa Ann's mother Mary Ann Gehring. It is the only way to ensure that'll never hurt another child. In fact, only when Midaughter can come back and be reunited with us could that monster ever see the light of day. Born in Santa Clara, California in 1950, Doreen Ray Berbert was raised by loving parents in a small, close-knit, deeply wholesome community. Even from a young age, little Doreen was described as having a generous and compassionate spirit, and for some it was no surprise when she opted to pursue a career in nursing after obtaining the appropriate qualifications there and found work as a physical therapist in a suburb of San Francisco. She found an apartment there, relocated in early 1975, and after a few months' worth of settling in, she met a guy named Mike. Mike's full name was William Mitchell Dennis, and he worked a well-paying job as a paint sprayer at a nearby Lockheed Martin factory. Seemed shy, and the anxiety of talking to a girl as pretty as Doreen exacerbated Mike's slight stutter. He believed the stutter was the reason he had such terrible trouble finding dates, but Doreen thought it was the sweetest thing she'd ever seen. There was this handsome brown-eyed man who thought that she was so pretty, could barely speak, so instead of rolling her eyes and walking away as so many other women have done before Doreen knew his patient, she waited for Mike to pluck up the courage to ask her out on a date, and when he did, she accepted. Mike couldn't believe his luck, while Doreen seemed over the moon, and over the course of the next few months, they fell in love and got married in the summer of 1975. 9 months later, in April of 1976, Doreen gave birth to a baby boy named Paul. At first, the couple seemed tired but happy, but as the stress of parenting began to take its toll, the couple's relationship began to break down. Doreen filed for divorce in 1977, and despite Mike's bitter protests, their marriage was quickly dissolved. Custody of their child was split between weekdays and weekends, with Mike being heartbroken that he could only see his boy for just 48 hours at a time. He had relished the opportunity to be a father and felt increasingly resentful of his ex-wife. In Mike's eyes, she had watched him embrace parenthood with a passion, only to snatch it away without any attempt at reconciliation. On the other hand, all Doreen wanted was to be happy and to provide the best life possible for her son. So while Mike descended into a deep depression, Doreen married a wealthy carpet store owner named Charles Burt in 1979. The newly married couple had a daughter, Deanna, but made it clear to little Paul that he would never be sidelined in favor of his little sister. They were a family regardless of her age, and although their situation was an unconventional one, there were notions of neglect abandonment oribus then in February of 1980. When Paul was just 4 years old, he decided to go exploring in the backyard. He wandered all around the lawns and flower beds until he came to the small but sturdy fence that separated the swimming pool from the rest of the backyard. Paul climbed the small fence with ease, then unbeknownst to his parents began walking around the edge of the swimming pool, teetering dangerously close to the water. Then suddenly the unthinkable happened and little boy slipped. Doreen was home at the time off the accident, but had been so occupied with her newborn daughter that she didn't notice when little Paul slipped away from her. By the time she noticed he was missing, it was too late, and as she ran into the backyard, she saw his tiny buddy floating face down on the surface of the swimming pool. To her credit, Doreen reacted so quickly that after pulling him out of the water, she was able to clear her son's airway before successfully yerving him. It seemed like nothing short of a miracle. But once Paul arrived in the nearby hospital, the most terrible of news was soon to follow. Doreen broke down when the doctors told her that little Paul was clinically brain dead and that there was very little chance of a complete recovery. 3 days later, she made the decision every mother fears facing, and after one final goodbye, Doreen opted to save Paul's life. Support turned off. Mike was furious and laid the blame for his son's death squarely at Doreen's feet. He filed a wrongful death LW suit against her, but although he managed to get the case to trial in March of 1982, the jury ruled in Doreen's favor and declared Paul's death was a tragic albeit avoidably silent. Following the suit's dismissal, Doreen cut off all contact with her former husband. She refused to meet with him. She refused to take his calls, and any envelopes that bore his handwriting were immediately thrown in the trash. There's no doubt that on some level Doreen really did feel responsible for her son's death, but she saw Mike's accusations of murder as little more than an attempt to punish her for divorcing him. Over the next 2 years, Mike's mental health deteriorated dramatically. Hatred for his ex and her new husband consumed him, poisoning almost every aspect of his life. His performance at work became so poor that he was forced to accept a salary reduction in order to retain employment, and he sought an increasing amount of solace through alcohol and prescription drugs. Yet while Mike sank further and further into the abyss, Doreen bounced back from the tragedy of a lifetime, and, suffering 2 consecutive escaries, she finally announced her third pregnancy in 1984. Her friends and family were elated, especially when the news came that she was expecting a little boy. And when asked when the due date was, they were told early November, just a few days after Halloween. Almost 9 months after the announcement, a heavily pregnant Doreen went trick-or-treating with the 4-year-old Deanna. Her husband Charles stayed at home to hand out handfuls of candy-toed costume tykes that walked up their driveway. Then, when his wife and daughter returned at around 8:50 p.m., he made a brief trip to a local grocery store to pick up some more candy along with a few beers. Charles had been gone for no longer than a few minutes when Doreen heard a loud knock at the front door. Believing it was nothing but trick-or-treaters, she left her daughter in the ground floor TV room and then went to door. When she opened it, Doreen saw not a group of giddy children, but a solitary man standing on the doorstep. He was dressed in regular clothing and shoes, but covering his face was an eerie cartoonish bee mask, and in his hand was a razor-sharp 18-in maquette. 4-year-old Diana later recollected that the man had roared, "I'm going to kill you," before her mother screamed for her to hide behind that couch. Little Dean did as she was told, her friend fingertips plugging her ears. It did little to drown out the screams, and then suddenly there was silence. Charles Evers' trip to the store lasted no longer than 15 minutes, but when he returned home and attempted to slide his key into the lock of his front door, he discovered it was already open. His blood ran cold as he pushed the door ajar. An ominous silence Hanging in there then, as he stepped inside, the sight that greeted him was like something from his worst nightmares. His wife lay face up on the carpet before him, surrounded by an unfathomably large puddle of blood. It had soaked into the carpet so heavily that its surface appeared as a swamp of uncoagulated plasm, and at its center lay the lifeless, heavily mutilated corpse of his beloved Dorian. Her killer had cut her to ribbons before they sliced open to her stomach and ripped her unborn son from her womb. To Charles, it appeared as if his defenseless baby boy had been torn from his mother and simply tossed into the next room with a sickening grievance. His next thought was for Dina, but when he heard her reply after calling out her name, the relief must have been indescribable. Somehow she remained perfectly still and silent while her mother and baby brother had been butchered and defiled, yet she remained in a deep state of catatonia for many months after. Uniformed police preceded the arrival of ambulance crews, but once the scene was secure, it was visited by a lone San Jose homicide detective named Bert Carroll. When I got there, it was like nothing I'd ever seen before in my life. He later said it was like a horror movie poster. The door was wide open, there was blood all over the hallway, and sat on a stool outside the porch was a Halloween pumpkin, the kind with a scary face carved into it. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Officer Jamie Saliver echoed the sentiment, saying it was bizarre. Easily theorious call I'd have ever respondedo, but what neither man mentioned to journalists was the fact that the killer's mask was lying on the doorstep, just feet away from Doreen's dead body. It too was streaked with her blood. After briefly questioning Charles, Bert officers were informed of the family's rocky history, and from that moment on Mike Dennis was the murder's primary person of interest. Law enforcement rushed over to Meek's home address, and as they advanced up the driveway, an officer used a flashlight to illuminate the interior office truck. The driver's seat, steering wheel, and door handle were all drenched and blued. After the officers knocked on Mike's door, he answered them wearing a bath robe and sporting wet hair. He seemed more than happy to answer any questions they had, and, inviting them inside, explained away a fresh cut to his hand, claiming it was an accident while preparing food. When informed of his ex-wife's violent murder, Mike barely reacted, and when he was unable to account for his whereabouts for the previous few hours, he was placed under arrest. Following Mike's detention, a thorough search of his residence was conducted by local law enforcement. It was then that officers found a receipt from a nearby hardware store along with a torn-off tag from an 18-inch machete. But it was only when officers walked into Mike's garage that they realized the extent of his guilt. It seems Mike had taken up woodwork over the previous few years and had worked his way up from larger to larger project until he was capable of constructing large boxes and containers. He had obviously become quite proficient in his work, as when officers saw what he'd most recently been working on, they didn't stop to wonder what they were looking at. Propped against one-off garage walls were two coffins, one labeled Charles and the other labeled Dorian. Mike Dennis stunned law enforcement when he denied all involvement in his wife's murder, and the shock was compounded when it was determined that there was no concrete evidence linking him to the crime. All the signs point to Mike, but without solid witness testimony or irrefutable forensic evidence, law enforcement had no choice but to release him. After 48 hours, they were, however, able to obtain a blood sample from him, and when it was discovered that his blood type matched that of the mysterious third party at the scene after Ian's murder, Mike was rearrested on November 5th of 1984. Detectives were able to trace the mask found at the Herbert home to one Mike wore at a Halloween party the previous year. A party-goer even took a photograph of Mike wearing it, and was able to confirm that it was indeed him behind the garish black and brown rubber. Detective Bert Caro attested, "I talked to this girl and she goes, last year we went to this party and he was dressed like that." Now, crossing my fingers, I said, "Did anybody take pictures by chance?" And she goes, Oh yeah, the guy took a ton of pictures. If he hadn't been so snap-happy, might never have Gotham Mike's trial commenced in July of 1988 and, insulting with his attorney, decided to plead guilty to the murder of his ex-wife. Mike also pled guilty to the murder of her unborn son, but claimed that he had no idea that she had been pregnant at the time of the attack. This is hard to believe, as Doreen had been heavily and visibly pregnant during Halloween of 1984. It's likely that the first thing Mike noticed about his ex was the rotund abdomen, and considering the fetus was torn from her lifeless womb, it's reasonable to suggest that their realization only enraged him. Further, he languished on California's death row until September of 1999, when he was put to death in the state's gas chamber. When news of his death reached their ears, Charles and Deanna Scott say that for their sake of their own mental health, they worked hard to find it in their hearts too. Forgive my Dennis, I want him to know that we survived. Diane said, I want him to know that we're making it. I want him to know hasn't conquered us. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7:00 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday night. If y'all get a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit or over email, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel, and check out the Let Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations and save huge on data located anywhere you listen to podcast. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, dodo do do dodo.